Welcome to Hacking Your ADHD. I'm your host, William Kerb, and I have ADHD. On this podcast, I dig into the tools, tactics, and best practices to help you work with your ADHD brain. Hey team, this week we're talking misinformation, which is an interesting topic because it feels like it should be something where it's just easy to define and identify. We've all seen stuff online where we looked at it and went, how the heck does anyone fall for this kind of stuff? And that's actually something that plays right into the hands of falling for misinformation. When we think we're immune to something, we're not on the lookout for it when it isn't quite as straightforward. It's the stuff that rhymes with the truth. It's the stuff that rhymes with the truth that is often easiest for us to fall for. While it's easier than ever for us to get access to ADHD information, it also means we're exposed to more misinformation about ADHD than ever as well. But with a little bit of caution, I think we can muddle our way through fairly well. And what I mean is that we're just going to have some rules that we should apply when we're evaluating this information that we're presented with. So in today's episode, we're going to look at some of those rules and some of the ways that we might be misinformed and misled with what we know about ADHD. If you'd like to follow along on the show notes page, you can find that at hackingyyouradhd.com/199. All right. Keep on listening to find out how you can cure your ADHD for 5 easy payments of $9.99. I think a perfect example of how easily misinformation can pass our filters comes from earlier this year when there was this image of the Pope in a big puffy white coat being shared around social media. This picture was actually AI generated. But most people didn't clock the AI nature of the photo. And why would they? It was just a photo of the Pope in a coat. I know when I saw it in my feed, I glanced at it and scrolled right on by. Didn't give it a second thought. In fact, had I not had it pointed out to me that the photo was AI, I would have never known. Although that's partially just because I would have never thought about it again. But that's kind of the point here. I didn't even think about the need to try and clock this image. Now, this was earlier before quite so many AI images had got on the internet, and I'm far more vigilant now. But this is also a place where we're most vulnerable. Algorithms amplify sensational content, and unverified information can easily spread from repost to repost. We get hit with something that seems plausible enough, and then we believe that we don't even need to do our due diligence because, well, I trust Steve, he wouldn't post something that he didn't verify. It's also important for us to realize that when we're getting misinformation, at least in regards to ADHD, it's usually not particularly malice. Often enough, it's someone who is fairly well-meaning passing on information that they either heard wrong or misinterpreted. For example, you may or may not have heard about how you shouldn't take your ADHD medication with your morning orange juice, or perhaps more along the lines of citric acid or ascorbic acid if someone is trying to be more specific. I actually got fairly curious about this because it felt like something that might be interesting to cover for the podcast. And I also was hit by this red flag of the whole, why is nobody talking about this issue? But then as I dug it deeper, I wasn't able to find that many reliable sources on this particular issue. Now, since this is a complex issue, I decided to try and find an expert. And one of the people I turned to is one of my friends who is a biomathematician working in pharmaceutical testing. Hey, we've all got friends like that, right? Just run-of-the-mill things. Anyway, he was kind of surprised that this was a question at all because he told me to just look in the documentation that is included with my prescription because that will have the best information about drug interactions. Makes sense. So I read through that entirely too dense document and there wasn't a whole lot that was warning against these interactions. Now, just to be clear here, I'm currently taking Adderall, so that piece of data is only relevant to that medication. If you take another medication, you may have different interactions. Every medication is going to have its own rules. I also want to mention that this whole taking ADHD medication with citric acid thing that has spread was also a red flag because it was not being specific enough. It said ADHD medications. It did not specify medication down to which medications are going to be affected. And that specification is really important here. So even with that said, I was still finding information from fairly reputable sources saying that, yeah, you should avoid citric acid for an hour before or after before taking any ADHD medication, or at least stimulant medication. From what I can gather, this is only due to an overabundance of caution. Apparently, there is a mechanism that has the potential to create an interaction specifically with the stimulant-based medications, where gut pH, the alkalinity acidity, can reduce the absorption. However, this interaction isn't something that you typically see as clinically significant. That is, while it is possible, it isn't likely to have an effect that you'd particularly notice. And with this in mind, the recommendation becomes to avoid these foods with citric and ascorbic acid only if you are noticing your medication isn't working as expected. Part of the confusion here also stems from the fact that these interactions don't exist within a vacuum. It's not like we're going to be pounding 3 glasses of orange juice and then taking our meds and nothing else. Well, not everyone at least. There are usually too many other factors going into play here that have a much larger impact on your day-to-day functioning. And I think this is a place where we can step back and realize that I just spent the last few minutes talking about how I went about verifying a fairly innocuous post about taking your meds with OJ. Well, it probably took me less than 30 seconds to see the initial post about it, but then it took me more than an hour to try and actually verify that information. And the worst part is that the answer ended up being, well, kind of maybe sometimes. And that is a huge issue when we come across things with misinformation. It takes more time to verify than it takes to initially take in that misinformation. And that's kind of the point we were talking about in the beginning. It wasn't that this information was straight up misinformation, but it also wasn't exactly accurate. But more importantly, I think it's something that can often mislead people into focusing on the wrong things, because one of the most important questions we can ask about this kind of information is, compared to what? As in, when you are presented with something that has an effect, it is important to understand the relevance of what else might have an effect and what the magnitude of those effects are compared to each other. One example of this idea comes from Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, which popularized an idea called the relative age effect, which takes research from a Canadian psychologist, Roger Barnsley, where in a study he found that a significant number of elite players were born in the earlier months of the year. He found that this was tied to age cutoff dates for youth hockey leagues, January 1st in Canada, meaning that players born earlier in the year were often more physically mature than their younger peers. More plainly stated being that someone born in January compared to someone born in October is going to be a much bigger kid because kids develop more on month-to-month than they do on year-to-year base. Alright, so this effect has then since been seen in a number of other sports, with some findings pointing to that in sports where the relative age effect is strongest, athletes born in January to March may be 20 to 40% more likely to reach an elite level. This is due to a snowball effect where those who show that early potential, and that being due to the fact that they are physically more mature, are more likely then to get more attention from coaches and more playtime to develop skills. The idea being that those initial advantages keep giving those athletes a cumulative advantage because each year they are more likely to continue having that first opportunity to develop those advantages, and that just compounds year after year. In an incredibly competitive field like professional athletics, that feels like a huge advantage. But it's also something that tends to see diminishing returns. As athletes progress into older age groups in professional leagues, the impact of the relative age effect diminishes as individual talent, work ethic, and other factors become more important. In fact, we see that genetics, coaching, personal drive, and injury prevention are going to have a much more significant effect than birth month alone. One of the strongest indicators, in fact, is whether or not someone will go pro in a particular sport is simply whether or not if they had a parent who was a pro in that sport. So that just is genetics. And this is important to understand because birth month alone will have basically no effect on an individual who don't have any other sort of advantage. I mean, it won't matter what month I was born into, I'm not going pro in sports because I don't have the drive to do that. So, while birth month is a factor and can play a significant role in someone's development on the road to professional sports, it might actually be one of the least important metrics to look at. Now, enough of this tangent. Let's bring it back to what we were talking about, which was the effect of citric acid on stimulant medication. So, while that can have an effect, other factors are going to play a much stronger role. In the scheme of ADHD management, it's important that we're looking at things like diet, sleep, exercise, and our support systems, as well as a host of other things. Of course, for many people, medication is going to play a vital role, and so knowing if your medication is working as intended is going to be important. However, that's only a small piece of what's going to be going on here. While I've seen a lot of stuff about this effect of citric acid and stimulant medication, I haven't seen anything that actually speaks to the magnitude of the effect that you might find when this interaction occurs. My takeaway from all this is that if you are experiencing inconsistent results from your stimulant medication, yes, this is possible that it could be a factor. But again, back to the point earlier, as compared to what? I know one of the biggest factors for me about if I'm going to have a productive day or not has a lot more to do with the quality of my sleep from the night before. Peak medication effectiveness is going to mean nothing if I'm dead tired for the day. And this is a question we often want to ask when we're considering the information we're getting online. The compared to what question. Because often, while the information we're getting isn't misinformation, it's still misleading us about what we should focus on. When we're trying to get our ADHD management in order, it's important for us to focus on the big wins instead of the things that, well, they'll get the needle moving, they don't do it in a significant fashion. And I think this is one of the biggest takeaways from this episode, is that how misinformation often isn't just blatant lies about what ADHD is and isn't. So in 2022, a study titled TikTok and Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, a cross-sectional study of social media content quality, found that about half of the analyzed videos were misleading. And I think their usage of the words there is important because they weren't saying that a majority of what they found was misinformation, just that the information could lead viewers to the wrong conclusions. The most common examples were misattributing certain specific symptoms as being ADHD specific. Of course, they did find other things that were straight misinformation, such as stating that object permanence is an issue with ADHD. And this probably comes from people mistaking the idea of out of sight, out of mind with object permanence, which is instead a developmental milestone for babies for when they understand the world exists beyond what they can see. Seems very similar to our issues with out of sight, out of mind, but it is a world of difference. Now, despite some of my best efforts, I wouldn't be surprised if a number of my episodes wouldn't be classified as misinformation as well. While I try to provide context and caveats for my monologue-based episodes and try to minimize when guests are being too bullish with their statements, I can say with certainty that there are going to be things that I have missed. I mean, I've taken down more than a couple of episodes where I've had people write in to let me know about some of the mistakes. And just a quick shout out for people that do that. I'm always so very thankful when people are doing it, even if I might not get to your emails about it, because I don't want to be peddling bullcrap, and when people can point things out that I've made mistakes on, I really appreciate it. All right. Additionally, there are also aspects of ADHD that would scientifically be categorized as misinformation simply because of the difference between lived experience and what's in the DSM-5. For example, I know one of the most popular episodes I have is on emotional regulation, which isn't part of an ADHD diagnosis. In fact, an ADHD diagnosis doesn't cover anything about emotions. The diagnosis used to, but emotions were removed in a push to make the diagnostic process more quantifiable, and unfortunately, emotions are notoriously hard to quantify. Nonetheless, emotional regulation is something that most people with ADHD have some struggles with. So, does talking about emotional regulations in regards to ADHD constitute misinformation? I would say no, but I can see the argument for it being kind of misleading sometimes. And yet, this is where things get tricky. I mean, looking at what I've written, I can see a lot of language where I'm couching what I say. I use phrases like many people with ADHD experience, because this isn't a universal experience, and that helps build in some of the nuance around this issue. Often, I see this kind of nuance lost in short-form content like TikTok or memes. For example, I just scrolled through some of my downloaded memes and found one that's just a tweet that says, "I accidentally relaxed too much, and now I don't have enough anxiety to get stuff done. #ADHD. I could absolutely see how this could be classified as ADHD misinformation, because that's not how ADHD works in a clinical sense. However, in a lived experience sort of way, I absolutely get this message being shared. That's partially why I downloaded it. And because it's just a tweet, it isn't like it's going to have a whole lot of context around it. And I wouldn't expect it to. Sharing a meme about how my ADHD feels shouldn't bear the same amount of scrutiny that a book does. Same goes with the 60-second video on TikTok. It's not meant to be an all-encompassing look into what's going on. More often than not, it's just a starting point to consider an idea. It's important to remember that no singular thing is going to make all the difference in all the things. With that said, doing something like getting good sleep or really figuring out your medication can make the difference that makes everything else easier. Even then, though, doing just that one thing isn't going to be enough. It's just the first step. I often see misinformation as a symptom of people trying to make sense out of complex ideas, or sometimes going the other way and making things that are fairly simple more complex than they need to be. There have been plenty of times when I thought I understood a concept fairly well, but once I tried to dive in and really talk about it, I found myself lacking that understanding. It's easy to convince ourselves we know how something works when we really only have a basic understanding. Misinformation can be deceptive not only in its simplicity, but also in the fact that it often isn't spread through malice intent. One of the unfortunate side effects of how misinformation is often portrayed in the media is that we often have this idea that who is ever spreading the misinformation is doing so on purpose. Now, to be clear, Sometimes that absolutely is the case, but more often than not, there's nothing sinister going on behind the curtain. Now, this is complicated by things like conspiracy theory, internet trolls, and grifters. While I do argue that more often than not people are not spreading misinformation on purpose, I am aware that there are plenty of bad actors out there, so we do have to be careful sometimes. In the next installment of the series, we'll be getting more into those bad actors and talking about some of the conspiracy theories that spread around ADHD and misinformation, but I think we've hit on enough for today. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. Before you go, though, let's do a quick rundown of today's top tips. 1. Always verify the credibility of the information, especially when it's health-related. It's easy for misinformation to spread, especially when it gets some aspects of the truth correct while misleading you about other areas. 2. Be aware that misinformation often stems from oversimplification or well-meaning errors, not from malice. This doesn't mean that it can't still cause harm, but it does mean that we still need to have diligence even when it comes to trusted sources. We all make mistakes. I know I do. 3. Use the question, compared to what, to help you understand the full context and relevance of advice. Try to focus on implementing big wins instead of focusing on the small minutia. Alright, that's it. Thanks for listening. I'd love to hear what you thought of this episode. Feel free to connect with me over at hackingYourADHD.com/contact. If you'd like links or to read this episode's transcript, you can go to the show notes page at hackingYourADHD.com/199. And now for your moment of dad. A weasel walks into a bar and the bartender says, "Wow, I've never served a weasel before. What can I get you?" "Pop," goes the weasel.